mapping an unclaimed sector 11 light-years past the last confirmed Federation border. Nothing about the mission profile suggested anything but boredom. Lieutenant Commander Data was 3 hours into a long-range scan of a classum, planet's atmospheric composition, when the ship's sensors returned something that made him tilt his head in that small, precise way that meant even an android found a result strange. Captain, Data said, I am detecting an energy signature on the planet's surface that does not correspond to any known power source. Output levels are at their peak, comparable to a photon torpedo detonation. Sustained, repeatedly. Captain Picard set down his tea. Repeatedly. 17 times in the last 4 minutes, sir. Each spike lasts between 2 and 11 seconds. On the view screen, the planet turned below them, blue and green and utterly unremarkable, the kind of world Starfleet cataloged by the thousands and rarely visited twice. Worf's scans showed no orbital defenses, no satellite network, no warp signatures anywhere in the system. By every metric available to Federation science, this was a pre-industrial world, the kind of place you logged, flagged for the Prime Directive, and left alone. Except pre-industrial worlds did not produce sustained energy discharges that rivaled a starship's main weapons array. Counselor Troy, Picard said, your read on this. Deanna frowned, the particular frown she wore when something didn't fit the shape of the readings she was used to interpreting. I'm not detecting hostile intent, Captain. If anything, what I'm sensing from the surface reads as playful, competitive, like a sporting match. But the intensity of it is unlike anything I've felt from a civilization at this technological level. Riker leaned over the tactical display, arms crossed, jaw set in the expression that meant he was already running contingencies in his head. Data, can you isolate the source? Tempting now, sir. A pause, longer than Data's pauses usually lasted. Captain, I am detecting 2 distinct biological entities generating these energy signatures. They appear to be humanoid. Their power output, when converted to conventional units, would be sufficient to level a mountain range. Bridge went quiet in the particular way it did when everyone was doing the math and not liking the answer. Bring us into a standard orbit, Picard said. Passive scans only. I want to understand what we're looking at before we announce ourselves. They did not get the choice. The moment the Enterprise settled into orbit, one of the energy signatures on the surface simply stopped moving in whatever pattern it had been tracing across the terrain and turned, as if it had noticed something. Data's console chimed an alert that made his eyebrows rise a full 2 millimeters, which for an android was the equivalent of a shout. Captain, the signature is now moving directly toward our position. Vertically. Define vertically, Mr. Data. It is flying, sir, without a vessel. Current velocity estimate exceeds Mach 9 and is climbing. Nobody on the bridge had a protocol for this. There was no chapter in the Starfleet tactical manual for a single biological organism accelerating through a planetary atmosphere on a direct intercept course with a starship in orbit, using nothing but itself as the engine. Worf's hands moved to the tactical console on pure instinct, raising shields, though even he seemed uncertain what exactly he was defending against. The figure that appeared outside the ship, hovering in the vacuum of space as casually as a man standing on solid ground, looked for all purposes human, spiky black hair, an orange and blue outfit that Data's databanks would later, with some digital embarrassment, categorize as training gi martial arts, purpose unknown. He looked at the Enterprise's massive saucer section the way a child looks at an unusually shaped cloud, more curious than alarmed, and then he smiled and waved. He waved. Report, Picard said quietly, because there was nothing else to say to a man floating unprotected in space and waving at his ship. Life signs stable, Dr. Crusher said from her station, voice tight with disbelief. He's not wearing any kind of environmental suit, Captain, no visible technology at all. He should not be alive out there. Yet, Picard murmured. Riker made the call. Hail him. It took Data a moment to route an open frequency in a way that might actually reach someone with no obvious communications device. But somehow impossibly, when the channel opened, a voice came through clear and bright and completely unbothered. Oh, this is a really big ship. Are you guys friendly? I don't want to fight unless you want to fight, but if you do want to fight, that'd be pretty fun too. Bridge crew exchanged looks that ranged from Riker's barely suppressed disbelief to Worf's flat professional suspicion. This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation starship Enterprise, Picard said, choosing every word with the care of a man improvising first contact protocol for a situation the protocol had never imagined. We come in peace. We mean you no harm. May I ask who we're speaking with? Goku, nice to meet you, Captain. Hey, do you guys want to come down and see what's going on? Me and Vegeta are just training, but there's a whole city nearby. You could meet everybody. Troy's hand found Picard's arm lightly, a signal they had used 100 times before. He glanced at her. She gave the smallest nod, genuine invitation, no deception in it that she could detect. "We would be honored," Picard said. "To make contact with your people properly, might we arrange a landing party?" "Sure, just don't stand too close when we spar, okay?" Vegeta gets pretty into it. Channel closed. On the bridge, for several seconds nobody spoke. "Number 1, Picard finally said, "assemble an away team, yourself, Data, Dr. Crusher, Counselor Troy. I want full tricorder readings on everything, and I want them the moment we're on the ground." Worf cleared his throat. "Captain, I would advise a security detail." "Noted, Mr. Worf, you'll be joining us." Picard rose from his chair, smoothing down the front of his uniform in a gesture that did little to settle the unease plainly written across his face. "Whatever that being is, whatever this planet is, Starfleet has never encountered anything like it. I intend to understand it before we decide what it means for us." The transporter room hummed to life a few minutes later, 6 figures dissolving into light and reforming on solid ground with the disorienting immediacy that away teams had long since stopped noticing. What greeted them when their vision cleared, however, was nothing any of them had experienced before. The air smelled of turned earth and ozone, the particular scorched copper tang that lingered after a lightning strike. Except it wasn't fading, it was constant, rolling off a wide crater some 300 meters away where 2 figures circled each other in a blur too fast for the human eye to properly track. Every few seconds the air itself seemed to compress and release with a concussive crack, shockwaves rippling visible dust off the ground in expanding rings. Data's positronic processing registered it before his organic crewmates could react, his head snapping toward the crater a full half-second before Worf's trained reflexes caught up. "Captain," Data said, "the energy output I am now measuring from close proximity exceeds anything in Starfleet's tactical database. If this is training, sir, I have no comparable frame of reference for what battle would look like." Riker's jaw tight. "Data, tricorder readings, now." "Tempting, sir, the tricorder is struggling to categorize the readings. It is registering the energy as simultaneously biological, kinetic, and something the internal database is labeling, for lack of a better classification, as unknown radiant force." Deanna pressed a hand to her temple, eyes closed, writing out something that was clearly more intense than the readings she'd taken from orbit. "There's so much emotion bound up in the power itself. Joy, focus. It's not like weapons fire, Captain, it's closer to art, competition. I don't think either of them means the other harm." That was the moment one of the combatants noticed the away team. The shockwave stopped. The dust settled in an unnatural stillness, and a man with spiked black hair and an intense, almost affronted expression on his face turned from his sparring partner and crossed the distance between them in something that should not have been possible to see, closing 300 meters in under a second. He landed in front of the away team without so much as displacing the air around him, arms crossed, scowling at each of them in turn like they'd personally interrupted something sacred. "Who are these clowns, Kakarot?" The man snapped over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off Worf, who had with admirable restraint not yet reached for his weapon. "That's the people from the big ship. I told you about them, remember?" Goku landed a moment later, considerably more gently, grinning at the away team like they were old friends rather than beings he'd met for the first time an hour earlier from a hovering position in the vacuum of space. "Vegeta," the first man said flatly when it became clear introductions were being left to him by default. "And before any of you get ideas, I don't care what fancy ship you crawled out of. If you're strong, I'll respect that. If you're not, stay out of my way." Picard, who had negotiated with Romulans, Klingons, and beings of pure energy across 3 decades of Starfleet service, found himself momentarily at a genuine loss for the correct diplomatic opening. "Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the United Federation of Planets, we come seeking peaceful contact and mutual understanding." Vegeta snorted. "Federation of Planets, cute. You people conquer a lot of worlds with that little floating box of yours." "We do not conquer worlds," Worf said, low and dangerous, stepping half a pace forward. "Good," Vegeta said, unbothered, already turning away, apparently having decided the conversation held no further interest for him. "Then we won't have a problem." Goku, in stark contrast to his companion's prickly indifference, seemed delighted to have visitors, immediately launching into an explanation of Kai that made about as much practical sense to Data's translation matrix as trying to define color to someone without eyes. It was, Goku explained cheerfully, the energy of life itself, something every living being possessed that could be trained, focused, and unleashed, though most people on his world never bothered to develop it past the barest baseline. He demonstrated by raising one open palm, and a small, controlled sphere of blue-white light bloomed above it, warm and humming faintly, close enough that Dr. Crusher's tricorder screamed a dozen contradictory readings at once. "That is roughly 200 times the yield of a standard phaser blast. Data said quietly, staring at the tiny orb of light hovering in a stranger's palm as though it were a party trick, compressed into an area smaller than my hand. "This is the barest fraction of what he's capable of," Troy murmured, her eyes still closed, still processing the depth of what she was sensing beneath the casual demonstration. "Jean-Luc, what we're feeling from him right now is a fraction of his actual capacity. I don't think we've seen anything close to a ceiling." Picard absorbed that in silence, watching the small glowing sphere pulse gently in Goku's hand, watching a man who looked entirely ordinary hold something that could, by every reading his crew could produce, erase a city block without visible effort. "Mr. Data," he said finally, "I want continuous sensor logs of everything from this point forward. Dr. Crusher, full biological workup with Mr. Goku's consent, of course. Counselor, stay close to me. Number 1, coordinate with Mr. Worf on away team security posture, but I want it subtle. We are guests here, and I suspect we are considerably weaker guests than we are accustomed to being." It was, for a man who had faced down the Borg without flinching, an unusually candid admission. But even Picard, staring at a species capable of producing planet-cracking energy from something as mundane as a training exercise, understood that the old rules of engagement, the calculus of shields and torpedoes and tactical superiority that had defined every first contact scenario Starfleet had ever prepared him for, simply did not apply here. They spent the better part of the afternoon in the company of Goku and, at a wary distance, Vegeta, who never fully dropped his suspicion but who also, notably, never attacked. Goku introduced them to the strange, warm, almost childlike hospitality of his world, insisting they come meet his family, his friends, promising there was so much more to see. Deanna found herself unexpectedly moved by the sincerity radiating off him, an emotional signature so uncomplicated and genuine that it stood in stark relief against the layered political calculations she was accustomed to reading in every diplomatic encounter the Federation engaged in. "He doesn't want anything from us," she told Picard quietly as the sun began sinking toward the horizon in shades of orange that no Earth sunset quite matched. "No advantage, no leverage. He's just happy to have met someone new, which makes him either the most refreshingly honest being I have ever encountered," Picard replied, "or the most dangerous if that sincerity is ever weaponized against him." Data, meanwhile, had quietly compiled 73 minutes of continuous sensor data, and the more he processed it, the more his internal threat assessment matrices returned results that bordered on the absurd. By any reasonable calculation, Goku alone, without ever raising his voice or his fists in anger, possessed destructive potential that dwarfed the Enterprise's entire weapons complement. Vegeta's readings, though more restrained, told a similar story, and both men had spoken almost in passing of others on their world who were stronger still. It was Worf who voiced what everyone was quietly thinking. "Captain, if beings of this magnitude exist casually in what appears to be an agrarian society with no interest in interstellar travel, what must exist at the edges of what they consider dangerous?" Nobody had an answer. The question hung in the warm evening air of an alien world, unresolved, as the crew of the Enterprise began to understand, for the first time in the ship's long and storied history of encountering the unknown, that they had stumbled into something that did not merely challenge their technology. It challenged their entire understanding of what power was. Far above them in orbit, sensors the crew had left running continued logging background radiation patterns across the planet, patterns that, had anyone been watching closely enough in that moment, would have revealed something stirring, distant, and patient, in a place the crew of the Enterprise had not yet thought to look. Something that had felt faintly the disturbance of a new and curious energy signature entering its corner of the universe. Something that did not appreciate being disturbed. If you want to see more advanced civilizations getting humbled by universes that redefine what power even means, hit that subscribe button and drop what crossover you want to see next in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Night on the training grounds did not bring the quiet the away team expected. Instead, as the sun dipped below jagged mountains in the distance, a second energy signature entered the region, smaller than Goku's and Vegeta's but distinct enough that Data's tricorder chirped an alert before the newcomer had even come into visual range. A boy no older than his early teens by Dr. Crusher's initial visual assessment, though his energy readings suggested otherwise, dropped out of the sky in a controlled descent, landing lightly a few meters from the group. He had lavender hair, calm, almost unnervingly composed expression, and eyes that swept over the away team with a kind of practiced wariness Picard recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had learned, the hard way, not to trust new arrivals at face value. "Dad," the boy said, glancing at Vegeta, "who are they?" "Visitors," Vegeta said, in a tone that made clear he considered the matter closed. "From a flying tin can, apparently friendly, apparently harmless." "I wouldn't say harmless," Riker said mildly, arms crossed, just diplomatically inclined. "Boy, Trunks," as he introduced himself a moment later with considerably more warmth than his father had shown, proved to be, in Troy's private assessment relayed to Picard in hushed tones, the emotional bridge the away team badly needed. Where Goku's friendliness bordered on incomprehensible and Vegeta's hostility bordered on the theatrical, Trunks occupied a middle ground, curious about the newcomers, cautiously willing to explain things his father and Goku took for granted, patient with the barrage of questions Data could not stop himself from asking. "You want to know how Kai training works?" Trunks said, settling onto a boulder as full dark fell and the twin moons of the region rose overhead, casting pale light over the crater still smoking faintly from the afternoon's sparring. "It's not really something you can just explain. It's something you feel first and understand later. Most people spend their whole lives never learning to sense it at all." "Fascinating," Data said, and meant it with the particular sincerity that made the word, coming from him, always land differently than when others used it. "Dr. Crusher's biological scans indicate no anatomical structure responsible for Kai generation. No organ, no gland, no discrete biological mechanism, and yet the energy readings are unambiguous." "How is this possible?" Trunks considered the question with the seriousness of someone who had clearly fielded it before in different forms from people less polite than an android. "It's not really biological, or I guess it kind of is, but it's more like, it comes from your whole self, your body obviously, but also your spirit, your will. The stronger your spirit, the more Kai you can generate and control." He shrugged. "I know that probably doesn't help your science stuff make sense of it." "The contrary," Data replied. "It suggests my instruments are measuring a phenomenon that exists partially outside conventional physical law. This is for a being built on the assumption that all phenomena are ultimately quantifiable, both deeply unsettling and profoundly interesting." Riker, listening nearby, allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "First time I've heard you use those two words in the same sentence, Data. It is, Commander, an unprecedented day." Conversation continued long into the night, and slowly, carefully, the away team began assembling a picture of the world they had landed on, a world its inhabitants called Earth, though it bore only superficial resemblance to the Earth in Federation records, populated by beings who called themselves human, but who evidently represented only the faintest baseline of what a human being on this world could become. Trunks spoke of tournaments held periodically where the strongest fighters on the planet gathered to test themselves, not for conquest or territory, but for the simple, uncomplicated joy of pushing their limits against one another. He spoke of techniques passed down through what amounted to martial arts lineages, of transformations that multiplied a fighter's power by orders of magnitude, of a hierarchy of strength that had almost nothing to do with technology and everything to do with training, will, and a concept the away team was still struggling to fully internalize. That power on this world was not a resource to be hoarded or weaponized in the way the Federation understood weapons, but something closer to a discipline, a practice, an extension of character itself. "There's something else," Trunks said eventually, and something in his tone shifted, a note of caution entering his voice that made Troy straighten with sudden focus. "Something you should probably know about if you're planning on sticking around." Picard said. "There are beings stronger than anyone on this planet. A lot stronger. Gods, basically. They don't usually bother with us. Most of the time they're not even paying attention to what happens down here. But when they do notice something, it's usually because something's changed. Something new showed up." He glanced meaningfully at the Enterprise's silhouette visible in orbit through a gap in the tree line above them. "A ship like yours, dropping into the system out of nowhere, putting off energy signatures nobody's ever registered before. That's exactly the kind of thing that gets noticed." Silence that followed was heavier than any that had preceded it that evening. "Define noticed," Worf said low. "I mean there's a god of destruction who watches over this whole part of the universe," Trunks said, with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an unremarkable fact of daily life. His job is basically to keep balance. Sometimes that means letting things grow. Sometimes it means, he trailed off, choosing his next words with visible care. Sometimes it means erasing things that get too big too fast if he decides they're a threat to that balance. Usually he's asleep most of the time, doesn't pay much attention unless something really catches his interest. You believe our arrival might qualify as catching his interest, Picard said. I don't know, Trunks admitted. Honestly, I hope not. But I figured you should know the risk exists before you decide how long you're planning on staying. Data's positronic mind was already cross-referencing every piece of data gathered so far against this new information, threading together a picture that grew more alarming the longer he examined it. If beings capable of casually producing torpedo-yield energy discharges in training exercises existed as a baseline on this world, and beings above them existed in a hierarchy extending up to literal gods of destruction, then the entire concept of advanced civilization that the Federation had built its exploratory doctrine around was, in this quadrant of reality, functionally inverted. Technology meant nothing here. The Enterprise's shields, her weapons, her warp core, all of it amounted to a curiosity at best and an irrelevance at worst against power scaling that operated on principles no engineering department could replicate or defend against. Captain, Data said quietly, pulling Picard a few steps away from the group under the pretense of reviewing sensor logs. I feel compelled to state plainly, should any entity on this world, or in the wider hierarchy Trunks describes, decide to act against the Enterprise with hostile intent, our current tactical systems would provide negligible defense. My assessment is not offered to alarm you unnecessarily, but I believe it is important that our response protocols account for genuine vulnerability, rather than the presumption of Starfleet's usual technological advantage. Picard absorbed this the way he absorbed most difficult truths, with a long, measured silence and a slow nod. Understood, Mr. Data. Then our priority becomes clear. We are not here to demonstrate strength. We are here to demonstrate good faith and to learn as much as we responsibly can, while we still have the privilege of being ignored by whatever sits at the top of that hierarchy. It was around this point that the away team's presence attracted attention of a different, considerably more mundane sort. A short, cheerful older man in a Hawaiian shirt, carrying what appeared to be a folding chair and an expression of deep, unrepentant curiosity, wandered into the clearing, having apparently followed the commotion of the day's sparring match, and introduced himself with a wide grin as Master Roshi, a martial arts teacher whose interest in the away team's presence, Troy noted with something between amusement and mild alarm, seemed to have several distinct and not entirely diplomatic motivations. He was followed shortly after by a woman with sharp eyes and sharper business instincts who introduced herself as Bulma, Trunks' mother, and who, upon learning that the visitors possessed a starship in orbit, equipped with technology far beyond anything her own considerable engineering expertise had produced, immediately began asking Data a series of increasingly specific and increasingly difficult questions about warp field mechanics that he found himself, for once, struggling to answer with complete confidence. Telling me your ship folds space to travel faster than light, Bulma said, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with the particular intensity of a genius who had just found a new and worthy problem to chew on, using a matter-antimatter reaction to power a subspace field. That's, she paused, visibly recalculating something in her head. That's actually really elegant, primitive compared to some things I've worked with, but elegant. She glanced up at Data with new appraisal. You built that? I did not personally construct the Enterprise, though I possess complete schematics and have performed numerous repairs and modifications to her systems, Data replied. I want to see those schematics. Doctor, Riker interjected smoothly, stepping in with the practiced ease of a first officer heading off a potential security concern before it could fully form. I'm afraid ship specifications fall under a certain degree of classification, even in the spirit of peaceful contact. Bulma's expression suggested she found this answer only marginally satisfying, but she let it go for the moment, with the air of someone filing the matter away for later negotiation. It was Master Roshi, however, who provided the away team with what proved to be the evening's most valuable insight, delivered between sips from a flask he produced from some concealed pocket in his shirt and long stretches of rambling that occasionally, without warning, sharpened into genuine wisdom. You people are thinking about this all wrong, he said, settling into his folding chair with a contented sigh. You keep asking how strong Goku is, how strong Vegeta is, like there's some number you can pin on it and understand the whole picture. But power here isn't static. It's not like your ship where the engine puts out the same thrust today as it did yesterday. These boys get stronger every single day they train. Every fight they survive makes them stronger than they were going in. You could scan Goku right now and get one number, and by next week that number's already wrong. That is a deeply unsettling principle from a tactical standpoint, Worf said. Good, Roshi said cheerfully. Should be unsettling, keeps you from getting complacent. Deanna, listening to the old man's easy laughter, found herself struck by an observation she shared quietly with Picard once the two of them found a moment alone near the tree line, away from the noise of the gathering. There's a philosophy running underneath everything on this world, Jean-Luc, something I don't think we fully appreciated from orbit. They don't see strength as something to be hoarded or protected. They see it as something meant to be pushed, tested, grown, shared even with rivals and enemies. Vegeta and Goku aren't just training partners. There's real respect there, real investment in each other getting stronger. Even though by every metric we use to judge these things, they should see each other as threats. Society that treats its rivals as instruments of mutual growth rather than existential danger. Picard mused, watching Vegeta a short distance away, arms still crossed, watching the away team with the same wary vigilance he'd shown since their arrival, though something in his posture had almost imperceptibly relaxed over the course of the evening. It's a philosophy the Federation has spent centuries trying to embody in our dealings with rival powers, with mixed success at best. There is something almost humbling about seeing it practiced so naturally, by beings capable of leveling cities, without any of the elaborate diplomatic architecture we've built to manage our own comparatively modest capacity for destruction. Reflection was interrupted by Goku himself, who wandered over with the loose, easy stride of a man entirely unburdened by the geopolitical and cosmological anxieties currently occupying his guests' minds, holding a large covered dish that smelled, even at a distance, extraordinary. Kai made way too much food, you guys should stay for dinner, he said, beaming. Everybody's gonna be there. Krillin, Yamcha, probably Piccolo if he feels like showing up. You'll like them, I promise. It was, Picard reflected, an almost absurdly ordinary invitation, extended with total sincerity by a being who had, hours earlier, demonstrated destructive capacity that dwarfed anything in Starfleet's arsenal, and who now stood before them holding a covered casserole dish with the earnest hospitality of a man inviting new neighbors to a backyard gathering. It was precisely the kind of jarring, category-defying contrast that Deanna had warned him to expect, and precisely the kind of contrast that made this world and its people so genuinely difficult to categorize using any framework the Federation had developed across centuries of first contact protocol. We would be honored, Picard said, and meant it. Dinner, when it came, proved to be its own kind of revelation. Introduced to a rotating cast of fighters whose energy signatures ranged from what Data classified as merely remarkable to readings that made his tricorder briefly lock up entirely, when a tall, green-skinned figure named Piccolo arrived without a word, and settled at the edge of the gathering with an expression of profound, watchful disinterest that nonetheless tracked every movement the away team made. The crew found themselves immersed in a community that defied every category Starfleet doctrine had prepared them to encounter. These were not soldiers. They were not a military hierarchy, nor a governing council, nor anything resembling the structured societies the Federation typically cataloged on first contact. They were, more than anything, a found family bound together by shared history, mutual respect, and an almost casual acceptance of power levels that would, in any other context the away team had ever encountered, have constituted a civilization-ending threat in their own right. Krillin, short, bald, and disarmingly friendly, spent a good portion of the meal peppering Riker with questions about what it was like to fly among the stars, his enthusiasm entirely unclouded by the knowledge, freely offered and freely accepted, that he was by a wide margin the weakest fighter at the table. Yamcha told long, self-deprecating stories about early failures that had the whole table laughing, including, to Worf's visible surprise, Vegeta himself, whose stern composure cracked briefly into something that might almost have been called warmth. And through it all, Trunks remained close to the away team, quietly translating cultural context, smoothing over the moments where Federation assumptions collided awkwardly with the realities of a world built on principles the crew was only beginning to grasp. It was Piccolo, silent for most of the meal, who finally spoke directly to Picard as the gathering began winding down and the twin moons climbed higher overhead. "You're thinking about this the wrong way," he said, echoing unknowingly Master Roshi's earlier observation, though delivered with considerably less warmth and considerably more weight. "You keep looking at us like we're the discovery, like we're the anomaly you came out here to catalog and take notes on." His eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on Picard with an intensity that made the captain understand immediately why even Vegeta seemed to give this particular being a measure of deference. "You're the anomaly here. A ship like yours with that kind of technology dropping into this system with no warning, things are going to notice you, things bigger than anything at this table. I think carefully about how long you plan on sticking around, and what you plan on doing once you attract attention you can't walk away from." Warning landed with a weight that settled over the away team like a physical thing, and Picard found himself, not for the first time that day, recalibrating his entire understanding of what first contact protocol was supposed to accomplish here. They had come seeking knowledge, connection, the quiet satisfaction of expanding the Federation's understanding of the galaxy's endless variety. What they had found instead was a world that operated so far outside conventional power structures that the very act of their presence constituted, by the account of nearly everyone they'd met, a genuine and unpredictable risk. Above them, in orbit, the Enterprise continued her silent vigil, sensors sweeping the system in patient, methodical arcs, unaware that somewhere far beyond the reach of even her most sensitive instruments, in a place of quiet judgment and cosmic indifference, something had indeed begun to stir. A presence that measured threats not in shield strength or weapons yield but in the subtler, stranger currency of energy that did not belong, patterns that disturbed the careful balance it had sworn eons ago to maintain. It had not yet decided to act, but it had without question begun to pay attention. The following morning brought with it a shift the away team felt before they understood, a subtle change in the texture of the air that Deanna Troi registered first. Waking with a start in the guest quarters Bulma had insisted on providing at Capsule Corporation, the sprawling, improbably advanced research facility that had turned out to be, by a wide margin, the most technologically sophisticated structure on the entire planet. "Something's different," she told Picard over a breakfast that felt almost absurdly domestic given the circumstances, her eyes distant, still parsing whatever impression had roused her. "It's not danger, not exactly, it's more like, attention, something out there noticed us overnight." Data, seated across the table with a plate of food he consumed purely as a social courtesy, looked up sharply. "Counselor, can you localize the source of this impression?" "No," she admitted. "It's too diffuse." "Too far away, maybe. But it's there, Jean-Luc, something knows we've arrived." Their conversation was interrupted by Bulma herself, striding into the dining room with the brisk energy of someone who had clearly been awake for hours, a data pad of her own design tucked under one arm, an expression on her face that mixed excitement with something more guarded. "You're going to want to see this," she said, setting the pad down in front of Data. "I patched into some old monitoring equipment we've got tracking cosmic energy fluctuations, leftover project from years back, mostly forgot. Last night, right around when you all showed up for dinner, we picked up something. A ripple, way out past the edge of the system but moving toward us." Data's positronic brain processed the readings in a fraction of a second, cross-referencing them instantly against the Enterprise's own sensor logs, still streaming continuously from orbit. "This corresponds with an anomalous subspace distortion my colleagues aboard the ship flagged approximately 6 hours ago," he said. "At the time, we assessed it as a natural phenomenon, possibly a gravitational anomaly associated with a nearby stellar body. In light of this new data, I believe we may need to revise that assessment." "Revise it to what?" Riker asked, already on his feet. "To the possibility that something is approaching this system with deliberate intent," Data said, "and that its point of origin correlates closely with directional data trunks provided regarding regions of space associated with beings of significant cosmic power." Room went quiet. Outside, through the wide windows of Capsule Corporation's dining hall, the sky remained deceptively clear, blue, and undisturbed, birds wheeling lazily over the distant hills. It was, Picard reflected, precisely the kind of morning that made the abstract, distant threat described the night before feel almost unreal, a story told over dinner rather than a genuine and imminent concern. That illusion did not survive contact with Vegeta, who arrived a few minutes later without knocking, expression grim in a way that immediately banished whatever remaining calm the morning had offered. "Something's coming," he said without preamble. I felt it the second I woke up. Big. Cold, the kind of energy signature you don't forget once you felt it before. His eyes flicked to Picard with something that might, in a less proud man, have been read as concern. You said your ship can detect things at long range. Can it tell me how far out this thing is? Data was already moving, pulling up long-range sensor telemetry on Bulma's console with practiced speed, his fingers a blur across the unfamiliar but rapidly learned interface. Cross-referencing subspace distortion patterns with current trajectory. Captain, whatever this is, it appears to be closing the distance at a velocity that defies our understanding of conventional propulsion. If current readings hold, it will reach this system within approximately 4 hours. 4 hours, Riker repeated. To do what exactly? Nobody had an answer, and the absence of one hung over the room with a weight that pressed harder than any concrete threat could have. Vegeta's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the away team's arrival, something in his usually contemptuous bearing shifted into a posture the crew recognized instinctively, from 1,000 tense briefings of their own. He was afraid and disciplined enough not to let it show as anything but grim readiness. Kakarot needs to know, he said, already turning for the door. And so does Wise, Picard asked, following him out into the courtyard, the rest of the away team falling in step behind. Attendant to the being I mentioned last night, Vegeta said, not slowing his pace. If anyone can tell us whether this is Beerus finally deciding to pay us a personal visit or something else entirely, it's him. The next several hours passed in a strange, suspended tension the away team found themselves ill-equipped to navigate, caught between the instinct to retreat to the relative safety of the Enterprise and the recognition that no amount of distance would meaningfully protect them if the approaching signature proved as dangerous as Vegeta's reaction suggested. Picard made the decision, after consultation with Riker and a brief, difficult exchange with Data regarding tactical options that all in the end amounted to variations of extremely limited, to keep the away team grounded, trusting in the judgment of beings who had lived beside this threat, whatever its true nature, for considerably longer than the Federation had known it existed. Goku arrived at Capsule Corporation within the hour, considerably more subdued than his usual cheerful demeanor, accompanied by a tall, slender figure the crew had not yet met, blue-skinned and immaculately composed, carrying a staff and an expression of serene, unbothered patience that stood in stark contrast to the anxiety radiating from nearly everyone else present. This is Wise, Goku said by way of introduction. He keeps an eye on things for Lord Beerus. Wise inclined his head politely toward the away team, his gaze lingering with evident curiosity on Picard, on Data, on the general strangeness of visitors who had arrived. By his own quiet observation a moment later, in a vessel of really quite charming if primitive design. Primitive, Data repeated, with the particular flatness that in a human might have carried an edge of offense, though in Data it registered mostly as genuine scientific interest in the comparison. May I ask what standard you are measuring against? Oh, all sorts of things, Wise said pleasantly, entirely unbothered by the question. But that's not really why I'm here, is it? You've all picked up on the disturbance, I take it. Rather hard to miss once it gets close enough. It Lord Beerus? Vegeta demanded, cutting straight past the pleasantries with the same impatience that had characterized every interaction the away team had witnessed from him. No, Wise said, and something in his tone, still light, still unhurried, nonetheless carried enough weight to make the entire courtyard go still. Lord Beerus is currently napping, as he has been for the better part of 3 weeks now, and I have absolutely no intention of waking him for this unless it becomes strictly necessary. What's approaching is something else. Something I'll admit has piqued my own curiosity rather significantly. Which is? Picard asked. Wise turned his attention fully to the captain, studying him for a long moment with an expression that suggested he was weighing exactly how much context a being from outside his own cosmology could reasonably absorb. Your arrival, Captain, created a rather unusual ripple, not dangerous in itself, understand, just new, unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things in a universe as vast and old as this one tend to attract attention from parties with a vested interest in unfamiliar things. What's approaching isn't a threat born of malice as far as I can tell. It's closer to curiosity, though I'll grant you curiosity from a being of sufficient power can look rather indistinguishable from a threat to those on the receiving end of it. That is remarkably unhelpful, Vegeta snapped. Do my best, Wise said, with a serene smile that suggested the observation troubled him not at all. Data throughout this exchange had continued monitoring the Enterprise's long-range sensors via a secure channel routed through Bulma's considerably upgraded equipment, and now looked up with an expression that, for an android, carried an unusual weight of concern. Captain, the approaching signature has entered a range where our sensors can produce a clearer profile. I'm detecting an energy output that, extrapolated conservatively, exceeds Lord Beerus's own signature as previously logged by a significant margin. Courtyard went very quiet. How significant? Riker asked. By a factor of approximately 4, Data said. Wise's pleasant, unbothered expression flickered, for the first time since his arrival, into something that might, on a being less composed, have registered as genuine surprise. Well, he said after a pause that lasted a fraction too long for comfort. That is interesting. Interesting is not the word I would have chosen, Worf muttered. The next 90 minutes unfolded with the particular unbearable slowness of a crisis approaching on a fixed and unstoppable timeline. The away team splitting their attention between coordinating with the Enterprise in orbit, where Geordi LaForge worked frantically alongside the ship's remaining bridge crew to prepare whatever meager defenses their technology could offer, and remaining grounded alongside Goku, Vegeta, and the small, tense gathering of fighters who began arriving at Capsule Corporation as word spread of the approaching signature. Piccolo arrived without a word, settling into a meditative stance at the edge of the courtyard. Krillin and Yamcha showed up together, considerably more subdued than the previous night's dinner, their usual banter absent. Even Master Roshi appeared, folding chair notably absent this time, his expression carrying a gravity the crew had not yet seen from him. You feel it too, Trunks said quietly, appearing at Picard's side as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the sky still stubbornly, deceptively clear. Everyone's showing up. Nobody had to call them. When something this big is coming, you just know to be here. Remarkable instinct for solidarity, Picard said. It's not really instinct, Trunks replied. It's just what we do. Whatever's coming, we face it together. That's kind of the whole point. It was Wise, eyes closed, staff resting lightly across his shoulders, who finally broke the tension with a soft, measured exhale. It's arrived in the system, he said. I'd suggest everyone brace themselves. Whatever this is, it's choosing to announce itself rather directly. Overhead, in a sky that had remained perfectly clear all morning, a single point of light appeared and grew, far too quickly for anything moving at conventional velocities, until it resolved in the space of a few disorienting seconds into a figure descending from the heavens with a slow, deliberate grace that felt, to every member of the away team watching, far more unsettling than any dramatic, violent arrival could have managed. The figure was tall, humanoid in shape, though clearly not remotely human in nature, its form limned with a faint, shifting glow that made it difficult to look at directly for more than a few seconds at a time, its expression as it came to rest gently on the ground at the center of the courtyard, unreadable in a way that made even Piccolo, arms crossed, jaw tight, take an involuntary step back. The figure said, and its voice carried an odd, layered quality as though several tones spoke the single word simultaneously, each slightly out of sync with the others. A new energy signature, metal, unfamiliar, not of this universe's usual pattern. Its gaze swept across the assembled fighters, across Wise, whose serene composure had notably sharpened into something considerably more alert, and finally settled on the away team, on Picard standing at their center, on the distant silhouette of the Enterprise visible even in daylight, hanging in high orbit like a silent, watching eye. You, the figure said, and the single word carried an unmistakable weight of focused, undivided attention. You are the source of the disturbance. Wise stepped forward smoothly, staff lowering fractionally, his tone still pleasant but carrying now an unmistakable edge of caution. And to whom do I have the pleasure of speaking? You're rather far from any territory I'm familiar with. Figure's attention shifted to Wise, studying him with the same detached, evaluating curiosity it had turned on everyone else. I have many names across many places that have found reason to fear me. You may call me what you like. I felt this world's balance shift. New power, new technology, arriving from outside the boundaries I have long observed. I have come to determine whether this shift represents growth, a pause, weighted, deliberate, or threat. Data's tricorder, still recording, still analyzing, produced a reading that made even his carefully calibrated positronic responses falter for a fraction of a second. Captain, he said quietly, this being's energy signature does not merely exceed Lord Beerus's baseline. It appears to be actively fluctuating, expanding in real time, as though it is only now beginning to reveal its true capacity. Vegeta, jaw clenched, power visibly rising around him in a shimmering aura that crackled the air, stepped forward to place himself bodily between the figure and the away team. Whatever you are, he said, voice low and dangerous, you're not laying a hand on them without going through every fighter standing in this courtyard first. Figure regarded him with something that, on a more expressive being, might have been read as faint, almost indulgent amusement. Loyalty, admirable, misguided perhaps, but admirable. Its layered voice shifted, taking on a tone that carried unmistakably the weight of genuine challenge. Very well. If this world wishes to prove that what arrived here yesterday represents growth rather than danger, let it prove that conviction in the manner this universe has always understood best. Air around the courtyard seemed to compress, every fighter present instinctively shifting into readiness, power levels spiking in a chorus of rising auras that turned the clear midday sky faintly, eerily luminous. Picard, standing at the center of it all, felt Deanna's hand close tightly around his arm, felt the full weight of her fear transmitted wordlessly through the contact, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and absolute in his chest that whatever peaceful, curious first contact scenario he had hoped to preside over had just irrevocably ended. "Mr. Data," he said quietly, "signal the ship, full alert status. And Data, prepare for the possibility that we may need every advantage we can produce, however small it may prove against what's standing in front of us." "Aye, sir," Data said, and for the first time since their arrival on this remarkable, dangerous, extraordinary world, his voice carried something that in a human would unmistakably have been fear. Above them the figure's glow intensified, and the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. The being did not attack immediately. Instead, it drifted upward, unhurried, until it hung suspended some 50 meters above the courtyard, surveying the gathered fighters below with the same detached, evaluating curiosity it had shown since its arrival. The morning light bent oddly around its form, refracting into faint prismatic edges that made Dr. Crusher's tricorder, transmitted live from the Enterprise's sensor array, spike with readings that defied every category in the Federation's biological and energy classification systems combined. "It is not attacking," Data reported, voice tight with the effort of processing data streams arriving faster than even he could comfortably parse. "It appears to be assessing. Cataloging our capabilities before committing to any course of action." "Then we don't give it an easy assessment," Vegeta growled, and without further preamble he shot upward, closing the distance in the space of a single heartbeat, a fist already crackling with barely restrained Kai aimed squarely at the being's chest. The being did not move. It did not raise a hand to block, did not shift its weight to dodge. Vegeta's fist connected and stopped dead, an inch from impact, as though it had struck something far denser than flesh should ever be. The shockwave from the arrested blow rippled outward regardless, flattening grass in a widening circle, cracking two of the reinforced windows along Capsule Corporation's east wing. Vegeta's face, for one unguarded instant, showed something the away team had not yet seen from him: genuine, unmasked shock. "Bad," the being said, voice still carrying that strange, layered quality. "Raw, untrained in comparison to what you could become, but not bad." Vegeta did not wait for further commentary. He unleashed a rapid combination, strikes and energy blasts flowing together in a blur that would have, against any conventional opponent, constituted a devastating opening assault. The being weathered every strike with the same unmoved patience, occasionally shifting a fraction to let a blast pass harmlessly by rather than bothering to block it, its expression never once losing its air of clinical, unbothered evaluation. Goku joined the fight a moment later, transforming as he rose to meet the being, his hair flashing gold, his aura roaring to sudden, blazing life, and for a few seconds the tempo of the engagement shifted, two fighters coordinating with the practiced ease of countless shared battles, their combined assault finally visibly forcing the being to actually move, to actually block, a forearm raised to deflect a blast that would otherwise have connected. "There," the being said, something that might have been satisfaction entering its many-layered voice. "Now we are beginning to have a genuine conversation." Data, watching the exchange unfold with every sensor the Enterprise could bring to bear, felt his processing cores working at a pace that, for him, constituted genuine strain. "Captain, the being's power output is scaling in direct response to the intensity of the assault it faces. It appears to possess no fixed ceiling that our instruments can identify. Whatever maximum capacity it holds, Goku and Vegeta's combined effort has not yet come close to revealing it." "Options, Mr. Data," Picard said, watching two of the most powerful beings he had ever encountered trade blows with something that treated their full effort as a mere opening gambit. "Limited, sir. The Enterprise's weapons systems, even at maximum output, would likely register as a minor irritant at best, given the power differential we are observing. I do not believe direct engagement from the ship offers a viable path forward. Wise, standing beside the away team with his staff held loosely, expression unusually focused, spoke without turning his gaze from the battle overhead. "He's not trying to destroy them," he said. "Not yet. If he wanted to end this, it would already be over. He's testing, which means there's still a conversation to be had if someone can find the right words before patience runs out on either side." "If it doesn't?" Riker asked. "Then I would strongly suggest everyone here has already said their goodbyes to anyone they care about," Wise said, with a lightness that did nothing to soften the weight of the statement. Piccolo entered the fray next, adding a third front to the engagement, his strikes precise and calculated where Vegeta's were furious and Goku's were relentless, the three of them beginning to form something that resembled genuine coordinated strategy rather than simple overwhelming force. The being's composure for the first time showed a hairline crack, a flicker of something that might have been mild surprise as a combined blast from all three fighters actually staggered it backward several meters. "Interesting," it said, voice carrying a fraction more weight than before. "This world holds more depth than my initial assessment suggested." It was in this moment, with the battle overhead reaching a fever pitch that shook the ground and cracked the sky with concussive light, that Trunks turned to the away team with an expression of sudden, sharp focus. "Your ship," he said. "Data said it can detect things our instruments can't sometimes. Different kind of sensors, different perspective." "That is correct," Data said. "Could it find a weakness, something we're not seeing because we're too busy trying not to die?" Data considered this with the full weight of his processing capacity, running correlations against every data point gathered since the being's arrival. "It is possible," he said slowly. "The being's power fluctuates in response to threat level, but fluctuation implies a baseline it is drawing from, and a limit to how quickly that baseline can be accessed. If I can identify the rate of that fluctuation precisely, it may be possible to predict windows where its defensive capacity lags behind an incoming attack." "Do it," Picard said. "Whatever support the Enterprise can provide from orbit, Mr. Data, I want it now." Data's fingers moved across Bulma's console with a speed that blurred to human eyes, cross-referencing telemetry, running the Enterprise's full computational array against the accumulating battle data streaming up from the courtyard below. Bulma, watching over his shoulder, let out a low whistle of genuine, reluctant admiration. "Okay, that's actually impressive. You're building a predictive model of a physics-breaking energy field in real time." "I've got graduate students who couldn't do that with 6 months and a supercomputer." "I have considerably more urgent motivation than a graduate thesis, Doctor," Data replied, without slowing. Above the courtyard, the battle had entered a new phase, one where Goku, Vegeta, and Piccolo's combined assault had grown sophisticated enough to actually draw blood, or whatever passed for blood on a being that seemed constructed from something closer to concentrated will than conventional biology. A thin line of glowing ichor traced along the being's forearm where Piccolo's precisely aimed strike had connected, and for the first time since its arrival, something that might have been genuine irritation entered its expression. "Enough testing," it said, and its voice lost the last traces of detached curiosity, hardening into something considerably colder. "Let us see what this world's true limit resembles." Aura surrounding it flared, doubling, then tripling in intensity, the light bending so sharply around its form that it became almost painful to look at directly. Goku, Vegeta, and Piccolo, sensing the shift, braced instinctively, power rising in response, but even Troy, monitoring the emotional currents of the fight from the ground, felt the sudden, sharp spike of genuine alarm ripple through all three fighters simultaneously. "They're afraid," she said quietly. "For the first time since this started, they're actually afraid," being moved. Not with the deliberate testing pace of its earlier engagement, but with a speed that rendered it nearly invisible even to Data's enhanced optical processing, closing the distance to Vegeta in a fraction of a second, and driving a single strike into his chest that sent him hurtling backward through the air, crashing through the remains of the crater from the previous day's training session, and carving a fresh trench 100 meters long before finally skidding to a halt. Vegeta. Trunks's cry cut through the chaos, raw with fear, and for a moment the boy's own power spiked dangerously, visibly straining against a threshold he had never before attempted to cross. Goku and Piccolo pressed the assault together, and for a handful of desperate seconds actually managed to hold the being's attention, trading blows at a pace that blurred the sky overhead into streaks of light and shockwave. But the outcome, growing clearer with every exchanged strike, was no longer in serious doubt. The being was no longer merely testing. It was methodically, without malice but without mercy either, demonstrating precisely how vast the gap between its own capacity and this world's greatest defenders truly was. It was at this critical moment that Data, working in furious tandem with the Enterprise's main computer, produced a result that made his internal processes surge with something that in a human would have been read as triumphant relief. "Captain, I have identified a pattern." The being's power output fluctuates on an 11-second cycle, expanding during offense and contracting fractionally during any transition between attacks. There exists a window approximately 0.8 seconds in duration during which its defensive capacity measurably lags. "Can we exploit that window?" Picard asked. "With the Enterprise's weapons alone," Data said. "But if the window could be identified in real time and communicated instantly to the fighters below, it is possible that a precisely timed maximum effort strike delivered during that gap could achieve considerably greater effect than anything attempted so far." Wise, listening to this exchange with sharpened interest, allowed himself a small, genuinely impressed smile. "Well now, that is rather clever for a species without any Chi sensitivity of its own." "Compensate for our limitations with careful observation, Mr. Wise," Data replied. "It is, in many respects, the foundational principle of Starfleet exploration." "Then let's put your careful observation to use," Trunks said, already rising into the air, jaw set with grim, determined resolve, "before we run out of people left standing to exploit it." Above, Goku and Piccolo continued their desperate, coordinated defense, buying time neither of them fully understood the purpose of yet. While below in the shattered remains of the training grounds, Vegeta pulled himself, bloodied and furious, back to his feet, power surging in response to injury the way it always had. The particular dangerous alchemy of pride and pain that had, throughout his long and violent history, made him more dangerous wounded than whole. "Send me the timing," he snarled toward the away team, voice carrying clearly despite the chaos, "and I'll make sure it counts." Data began the calculations that would in the next several minutes determine whether this world's greatest defenders could turn the tide against a being whose power had, until this morning, existed entirely outside anything the Federation's most advanced sensors had ever needed to comprehend. Above the courtyard, the sky continued to burn with light and fury, the fate of an entire remarkable civilization balanced on a window of opportunity lasting less than a single second, and on the fragile, untested cooperation between a Starfleet android's analytical mind and a warrior race's ferocious, unyielding will. 4 seconds to the window, Data called out. 3, 2, 1 now. Vegeta moved on the exact syllable, blasting off the cratered ground with every ounce of power his battered body could summon, a trail of golden light searing the air behind him. Goku and Piccolo broke from their defensive posture in the same instant, driving twin blasts of concentrated Chi toward the being's center mass to force its attention, to buy Vegeta the fraction of a second Data's calculations had promised him. The being's aura, mid-contraction exactly as predicted, flickered, thinned, and in that narrow, precious gap Vegeta's fist connected with the being's chest with the full, undivided force of everything he had left to give. The impact did not simply stagger the being. It folded visibly, the layered light of its form rippling like water struck by a stone, a sound tearing through the courtyard that was less an explosion than a note, deep and dissonant, that every fighter present felt in their bones rather than heard with their ears. The being was hurled backward, carving a smoking furrow through the sky before crashing down at the courtyard's edge, kneeling, one hand pressed to the ground, its glow guttering like a candle in a sudden wind. For one suspended, breathless moment, nobody moved. "Did we?" Krillin started from where he and Yamcha had been sheltering the civilians of Capsule Corporation behind a hastily thrown-up energy barrier. "Celebrate yet?" Piccolo said grimly, hovering, chest heaving, eyes locked on the kneeling figure. The being rose, slowly. And when it lifted its head, the detached clinical curiosity that had defined its every prior expression had been replaced by something considerably sharper, considerably more focused, an intensity that made even Wise's serene composure tighten by a fraction. That, the being said, voice stripped now of its earlier layered calm, singular and cold, should not have been possible, not from beings at this stage of development, not with technology this primitive lending assistance. Gaze swept past Vegeta, past Goku and Piccolo, and settled with unmistakable, deliberate weight on Data, on the away team clustered around Bulma's console. "You the metal when you found the pattern. I calculated a statistical probability based on observed data," Data said, with the careful precision of a being who understood with total clarity that his next words might well determine whether this conversation ended in negotiation or annihilation. "I offer no apology for it. My function is to observe, to analyze, and to assist those in my care. I performed that function, Being studied him for a long, silent moment, and something in its expression, still cold, still dangerous, shifted nonetheless into an assessment that had genuinely, fundamentally changed. A tool that thinks, it murmured. That adapts. That found the seam in my defense faster than any warrior on this world managed in the opening exchange. It took a step forward, and the ground where its foot landed cracked in a spiderweb pattern radiating outward. Perhaps I have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the disturbance I felt was never merely a new energy signature to be measured and judged. Perhaps it was a new kind of mind entirely, arriving in a universe that has grown complacent, believing it has already cataloged every form power can take. If you're looking for a fight to the death, Vegeta snarled, forcing himself upright despite the visible strain of injuries that would have ended a lesser fighter several exchanges ago, you can have one. But you're not laying a hand on that ship or the people on it while I'm still breathing. Loyalty again, the being said, persistent theme on this world. It raised one hand, aura beginning to rebuild, gathering with visible, terrible speed toward whatever threshold it had originally intended to reach before Vegeta's strike interrupted it. Very well, let us finish what... It never completed the sentence. The air above the courtyard split open with a sound like tearing silk, and a second figure descended through the tier with an unhurried, almost bored economy of motion, landing lightly beside Wise with hands tucked into the sleeves of a dark, elegant garment, violet-hued and unmistakably, palpably powerful in a way that made every fighter still standing instinctively drop into some measure of deference, Vegeta included, despite his injuries, despite everything. Wise, the newcomer said, voice carrying a note of mild, distinctly unamused annoyance. You let something wake me up. Do you have any idea what that means for my mood right now? My deepest apologies, my lord, Wise said, bowing his head with practiced, immediate contrition, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely displeased by the interruption. I did try to handle the matter without troubling you. Circumstances, I'm afraid, escalated somewhat past my ability to manage quietly. Beerus, for there was no mistaking who this newcomer was, the readings alone made Data's instruments strain toward their absolute upper limits, turned his gaze slow and deliberate, toward the being still hovering at the courtyard's edge, its half-formed aura flickering uncertainly now, its earlier cold confidence visibly, rapidly deflating under the weight of being observed by something it had evidently not accounted for in its assessment of this world's true hierarchy. And what, Beerus said, is this? Being of unknown origin, Wise reported smoothly, that arrived shortly after our newest guests. He gestured with his staff toward the away team, toward the Enterprise's distant silhouette in orbit. It seemed to take issue with their arrival. Things proceeded from there in the manner things generally proceed when issues are taken. Beerus's attention shifted, fully deliberately, to Picard, to the away team standing in a tight, wary cluster amid the wreckage of what had, less than an hour earlier, been a peaceful, ordinary research courtyard. His eyes, sharp and violet and entirely unreadable, held Picard's gaze for a long moment that felt, to every member of the crew present, considerably longer than its actual duration. The ones who arrived in the metal vessel, Beerus said. It was not a question. Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the United Federation of Planets, Picard said, drawing on every reserve of composure 3 decades of Starfleet service had built into him, meeting the gaze of a being whose casual power output, by Data's own increasingly alarmed readings, made even the day's earlier threat look modest by comparison. We arrived seeking peaceful contact and nothing more. I regret deeply that our presence has caused disruption on this world. Beerus studied him a moment longer, then let out a short, unimpressed exhale through his nose. Everyone always regrets it after the disruption's already happened. Rarely stops anyone from showing up uninvited in the first place. He turned back toward the still hovering being at the courtyard's edge, and his tone hardened, the mild annoyance sharpening into something considerably more absolute. You, however, you came into my territory, felt a disturbance you didn't understand, and decided the correct response was to nearly level a planet I happen to have taken a passing interest in preserving. That's the part I actually care about. Being's composure already fraying, cracked further under the weight of Beerus's attention. I meant no offense to the god of destruction, it said, and something in its many-layered voice had for the first time taken on an unmistakable note of genuine, wary caution. I acted only to assess whether the disturbance represented a threat to the balance you are sworn to maintain. Did it? Beerus asked. The being hesitated, its gaze flicked briefly toward Data, toward the away team, toward the distant Enterprise. I am no longer certain, it admitted. Their technology is primitive by the standards of beings I have encountered before. But the mind directing it adapted to a threat it had no prior framework for understanding in a matter of minutes and found a genuine weakness in my defenses. That is not the behavior of a threat to be dismissed. Nor is it, I think, the behavior of one that requires destruction to neutralize. Beerus considered this for a long moment, arms crossed, tail flicking with the idle, contemplative motion of a cat weighing whether a piece of prey was worth the effort of pursuing. Then unexpectedly, something that might almost have been amusement flickered across his sharp features. "You know," he said, addressing Picard directly now, "I get bored rather easily. It's something of a chronic condition, being a god who's already seen most of what a universe this size has to offer. New things are rare." Genuinely new things, rarer still. He tilted his head, studying the Enterprise's silhouette overhead with an expression that had shifted subtly but unmistakably from threat assessment into something closer to genuine, if characteristically prickly, curiosity. A civilization that builds metal ships instead of training their bodies, that relies on calculation instead of instinct. That found a way to matter in a fight against a being who could have erased this entire planet without much effort, purely because their thinking mind found an opening every warrior on this world missed. He looked back at Picard, violet eyes narrowing with something that was not quite a smile but occupied similar territory. "That's new, I'll admit it, that's actually new. I would prefer," Picard said carefully, "that our novelty not come at the cost of continued conflict, my lord." Beerus waved a hand, dismissive though not unkindly. "Relax, Captain, I'm not in the habit of destroying things purely for being interesting. Quite the opposite generally." His gaze cut back to the still hovering being and his tone hardened once more. "You, on the other hand, owe this planet considerably more than a passing apology for the mess you've made of my nap and my courtyard. I'd suggest making yourself useful somewhere considerably farther from my territory, and I'd suggest doing it now before my patience, which was already thin before you woke me, runs out entirely." Being did not argue. It inclined its head once toward Beerus, then toward Wise, and finally, with an expression that carried something almost like grudging respect, toward Data and the assembled away team. "Perhaps we will meet again," it said, "under circumstances less inclined toward violence." And then, without further ceremony, it dissolved into a streak of light that shot skyward and vanished, its energy signature fading from even the Enterprise's most sensitive instruments within seconds. The courtyard exhaled as one, the tension that had held every fighter rigid for the better part of an hour finally, visibly draining out of exhausted, battered bodies. Vegeta sank to one knee, allowing himself, for the first time since the crisis began, the visible weakness his pride had refused throughout the fight itself. Goku dropped out of his transformation with a long, relieved breath. Piccolo simply folded his arms and closed his eyes, saying nothing, though the tension in his shoulders had eased considerably. Beerus, meanwhile, had turned his full, considering attention back to Picard, and something in his expression suggested the conversation from his perspective was far from concluded. "So," he said, "Federation of planets, metal ships, technology instead of Kai." He circled the away team slowly, tail flicking, studying each of them with the frank, unhurried assessment of a being who had absolutely no concept of personal space and no particular interest in acquiring one. "You built all this without any ability to sense Kai at all. Our technology developed along entirely different principles," Picard said. "We have no innate capacity for the abilities we've witnessed on this world." "Fascinating," Beerus said, in a tone that suggested he genuinely meant it, an inflection considerably warmer than his earlier, more threatening pronouncements. "Wise, remind me later. I want a longer look at their vessel before I decide whether I care about them sticking around." "Of course, my lord," Wise said, with the easy compliance of an attendant long accustomed to his charge's mercurial interests. Data, watching this exchange with every sensor at his disposal, still recording, still analyzing, felt compelled to speak. "My lord, if I may ask, the being that departed, do you know its origin, its intentions moving forward?" Beerus waved a dismissive hand. "Some wandering judge of balance, probably. There are more of those scattered across the higher planes than you'd think, each one convinced their particular corner of the universe needs constant monitoring. Mostly harmless so long as you don't give them reason to think you're a genuine threat." He fixed Data with a considering look. "You handled that rather well for a tool built by people who can't sense a lick of Kai between them. Clever thinking. I respect clever thinking even when it comes wrapped in metal." "Thank you, my lord," Data said. "Though I would note the outcome relied equally on the courage of your world's fighters who bore the physical risk my calculations alone could not have survived." Beerus's gaze slid toward Vegeta, still kneeling, still catching his breath, and something that might almost have been approval flickered across the god's sharp features. "Yes, well, that part at least isn't new." He straightened, stretching with the languid unconcern of a being for whom the morning's near catastrophe had already become a minor, mildly interesting footnote. "I'm going back to sleep. Wise, wake me if anything else decides to be interesting. Otherwise, don't." "Understood, my lord," as Beerus rose into the sky unhurried. Already visibly losing interest in the gathered fighters and the battered courtyard alike, Picard allowed himself, for the first time in what felt like the longest hour of his career, a slow, careful breath of genuine relief. Round him, the away team began the quiet, exhausted work of taking stock, Dr. Crusher moving immediately to check on Vegeta's injuries, despite his gruff, half-hearted protests. Riker coordinating with the ship in orbit to confirm the Enterprise remained undamaged and battle systems remained on standby. Data continuing to log every fragment of data the encounter had produced with the meticulous thoroughness that had in no small part saved all their lives. Troy found Picard's side quietly, her earlier fear replaced now by something more contemplative, more measured. "We survived something today that by every reasonable measure we had no right to survive," she said. "We did," Picard agreed. "Though I suspect survival alone does not fully capture what we've learned here, Counselor. We came seeking first contact with a civilization we assumed we would understand within the familiar parameters of Starfleet's experience. What we found instead was a hierarchy of power that renders nearly everything we know about strength, about strategy, about survival itself, almost entirely obsolete." He looked toward Vegeta, toward Goku, toward the diminishing speck of Beerus vanishing into the upper atmosphere. "And yet we found a way to matter in the end. Not through strength we do not possess, but through the very qualities that have always defined this crew, regardless of what universe we find ourselves navigating." Trunks approached as the immediate crisis settled into its aftermath, offering a tired but genuine smile. "For what it's worth," he said, "not a lot of people manage to make Lord Beerus curious instead of annoyed. That's kind of a rare trick. Shall endeavor," Picard said, "not to test that particular trick too often in the future." Above them, the sky had cleared entirely, the morning's violence fading into memory as the sun climbed toward its zenith over a world that had, in the span of a single extraordinary encounter, revealed the true, staggering scope of what existed beyond the careful, ordered boundaries of everything the Federation had ever charted. The days that followed the confrontation settled into something the crew of the Enterprise had not expected to find on a world that had, within the span of 48 hours, revealed itself capable of housing gods. A quiet, not the absence of extraordinary things, but a kind of extraordinary calm. The particular peace that comes after a storm has tested everyone's limits and found, against considerable odds, that those limits held. Vegeta's injuries healed with a speed that continued to astonish Dr. Crusher, whose tricorder readings on regenerative capacity alone, she confided to Picard over the ship's daily briefing, could reshape Federation medical science for a generation if properly understood, and more importantly, ethically obtained rather than simply gawked at. "I've requested Vegeta's permission for a more thorough study," she said. He agreed on the condition that Trunks supervises and that I, in his words, don't get any ideas about turning him into a science experiment. "I think that's fair, entirely fair," Picard agreed. Data, for his part, had spent the intervening days in near-constant conversation with Bulma, the two of them trading schematics and theoretical frameworks with the delighted, occasionally combative energy of two brilliant minds who had, against all odds, found genuine intellectual equals in each other. Bulma remained deeply unconvinced that warp technology represented any kind of ceiling on what was achievable, and had already begun sketching, with characteristic confidence, a series of modifications she insisted could improve the Enterprise's subspace field efficiency by a margin Data found himself, somewhat reluctantly, unable to dismiss out of hand. "She's not wrong about the field geometry," Data admitted to Geordi over a private channel, once he'd returned briefly to the ship to consult on the modification's feasibility. "Her approach lacks the theoretical framework Starfleet engineering relies upon, but her intuition, informed by decades of solving problems no Federation textbook has ever cataloged, arrives at conclusions our conventional methods would likely take considerably longer to reach." "You're telling me a woman from a planet that doesn't even have warp drive just improved our engine specs," Geordi said, equal parts amused and impressed. I am telling you, Data replied, that genius does not require familiarity with our particular framework to produce results our framework would recognize as valid. It is, I find, a humbling realization. Formal negotiations, when they finally occurred, took place not aboard the Enterprise nor within the sprawling halls of Capsule Corporation, but in the same courtyard where the battle had unfolded days earlier, the cracked earth and scorched grass serving as a quiet, unspoken reminder of what had nearly been lost. Wise presided at Beerus's characteristically disinterested delegation, with Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, and Trunks representing the world's defenders, and Picard, Riker, and Data speaking for the Federation. The terms once reached proved simpler than Picard had anticipated. This world would remain, by its own overwhelming preference, outside the Federation's formal charter, its people uninterested in the diplomatic architecture and technological exchange that typically followed successful first contact. But an understanding was reached nonetheless, a promise of continued careful visitation, an open channel of communication rooted through Bulma's steadily improving equipment, and at Trunks's quiet insistence, a standing invitation for the away team to return, not as explorers cataloging a discovery, but as friends checking in on people they had come, in the space of a few remarkable days, to genuinely care about. The first outsiders who have ever really understood that this isn't about power rankings, Trunks said, as the formal proceedings wound down and the gathered fighters began drifting into the looser, warmer atmosphere of what had become, almost without anyone deciding it should, another shared meal. Most people who find out how strong everyone here is either want to fight us or want to use us. You just wanted to understand us. That matters more than you probably realize. Matters to us as well, Picard said. I confess, Trunks, that I arrived on this world with certain assumptions about what advanced civilization meant, assumptions built on centuries of Starfleet doctrine that measured progress largely in terms of technology, in terms of scientific achievement. What I found here has fundamentally challenged that framework, in ways I suspect will occupy Federation philosophers for years to come. Goku, overhearing this from a few paces away where he was, with characteristic enthusiasm, attempting to teach Riker the rudiments of sensing Kai with results that ranged from mildly promising to comically unsuccessful, wandered over with his usual easy grin. Does that mean you'll come back and visit? I still haven't shown you guys the hyperbolic time chamber, or introduced you to King Kai, or, I believe, Picard said, laughing despite himself, an unguarded sound the bridge crew rarely heard from their captain, that we have a great deal more to see on this world, Goku. And I intend to make good on that in whatever capacity our respective duties allow. Vegeta characteristically offered no such warm sentiment, though the absence of his earlier hostility spoke its own quiet volume. He approached the away team's departure with arms crossed, expression unreadable, and addressed Data directly with the particular bluntness that had by now become almost familiar to the crew. Your calculations saved lives today, he said. I don't forget that kind of debt easily. If your ship's ever in trouble out there and this world can help, you'll have it. That is a generous offer, Data said, and one I hope circumstances never require us to test. Get sentimental about it, Vegeta muttered, already turning away, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the gruffness masked something considerably warmer underneath. Wise offered his own farewell with characteristic pleasant unpredictability, informing the away team, apropos of nothing, that Lord Beerus had in fact taken sufficient interest in the Enterprise's design to request a formal tour, at some point in the indeterminate future, whenever the mood strikes him, which could be tomorrow or several decades from now. There's really no reliable way to predict it. Picard wisely chose to treat this as a genuine standing invitation rather than a diplomatic inconvenience, understanding well enough by now that maintaining goodwill with a god of destruction, however capricious his interests, represented precisely the kind of relationship worth nurturing with patience rather than schedule. As the Enterprise prepared to depart the system, the bridge crew gathered for a final debrief. The mood a curious blend of exhaustion, wonder, and the particular reflective quiet that followed genuinely transformative experiences. Picard stood before the assembled senior staff, hands clasped behind his back, considering his words carefully before speaking. We came to this system, he said, expecting a routine survey. What we found instead was a civilization that has forced this crew, and I suspect Starfleet's broader understanding of exploration itself to confront an uncomfortable truth that our metrics for measuring advancement, for measuring what constitutes a civilization worth serious study, have always been incomplete. We measure warp capability, weapons technology, social structure. We rarely measure the strength of conviction, the depth of loyalty, the willingness to stand between a stranger and annihilation purely because it is the right thing to do, regardless of what that stranger has to offer in return. He paused, looking around the bridge at his crew at Data, whose quiet, careful analysis had in the end made the difference between catastrophe and survival. We are none of us the most powerful beings in this universe. This mission has made that painfully, memorably clear. But power, as this remarkable world has taught us, was never truly the measure that mattered most. Data, standing at his station, allowed himself something that in a human would have been called a small, private smile. If I may add, Captain, I believe the experience has been instructive in another respect as well. I entered this encounter believing my function was purely to observe, to calculate, to serve as the crew's analytical resource. What I found in the moment that mattered most was that observation and calculation alone were insufficient. It was trust in beings whose capabilities I could not fully quantify, trust freely extended by Vegeta and Trunks in a calculation they could not verify themselves, that ultimately closed the gap between insufficient data and survival. I do not believe my programming fully accounted for that variable before this mission. I suspect it will going forward. Riker clapped a hand on Data's shoulder, a gesture of easy camaraderie that had become, over years of service together, entirely natural. Careful, Data, keep talking like that and people are going to start saying you've got more heart than half this crew. I would not object to that assessment, Commander, Data said, though I remain uncertain whether heart, in the metaphorical sense, is a quality that can be programmed or must instead be earned. Perhaps in the course of this mission I have begun to earn a small measure of it. As the Enterprise's engines hummed to life and the ship prepared to leave orbit, Picard took one final look at the view screen, at the blue and green world below that had, in the span of a few extraordinary days, redrawn the boundaries of everything Starfleet believed it understood about power, about civilization, about what it meant to be advanced. Somewhere down there, he knew, Goku was likely already back to training, Vegeta was likely already plotting his next level of strength, and Trunks was likely watching the sky, waiting for the day the Enterprise's silhouette might return. Mr. Data, Picard said, settling into his chair as the stars outside began to stretch and blur with the building charge of the warp core. Log this system's coordinates under the highest classification Starfleet protocol allows. This is not a discovery to be shared lightly, nor a world to be visited without the deepest respect for what we've learned here. Already logged, Captain, Data said. Though I confess I find myself already anticipating the day protocol permits our return. Enterprise leapt into warp, leaving behind a world of gods and warriors, of casual, staggering power wielded with a humility the Federation had spent centuries striving, with mixed success, to embody in its own dealings with the stars. And somewhere in the vast, star-strewn dark ahead, new mysteries waited, though none, perhaps, would ever again test quite so completely what the crew of the Enterprise believed they understood about the true measure of strength. Star Trek fans, drop in the comments what other Star Trek crew you want to see collide with the Dragon Ball universe next. Discovery, Voyager, the original Kirk-era Enterprise facing down Frieza himself. Let me know below. The story of the Enterprise's arrival in the world of gods and warriors is in many ways a story about the limits of assumption. Starfleet's centuries of first contact protocol were built on a simple premise, that technology serves as the reliable measure of a civilization's advancement, that scanners and shields and warp cores tell you with reasonable confidence what you're dealing with before you ever set foot on the ground. This mission shattered that premise entirely. The crew arrived expecting to catalog a primitive world, and instead found themselves, within hours, the weakest party in every room they entered, and discovered in that vulnerability something Starfleet's doctrine had never quite prepared them to value as highly as it deserved. The courage to stand beside people you cannot fully protect, purely because it is right. What made this crossover work wasn't a contest of who hits harder. Picard's crew never threw a punch that mattered. Their contribution was Data's mind, patient, analytical, willing to trust warriors he couldn't outfight to close a gap he could calculate but not survive alone. That's the throughline. Two civilizations built on opposite philosophies of strength, technology versus training, calculation versus instinct, finding that neither one was sufficient by itself. Vegeta's fist needed Data's timing. Data's timing needed Vegeta's fist. The world is permanently changed by what happened in that courtyard, if quietly. Bulma has a standing correspondence with a Starfleet android now, trading physics neither species fully understood before. Vegeta owes a debt he doesn't discuss but won't forget. And somewhere in the higher planes, a being that came looking for a threat to a race left instead, having learned that power isn't the only thing worth respecting. For the Enterprise, the journey home carries its own quiet weight. They didn't find a new ally for the Federation Charter, didn't return with new territory or new technology to catalog. They returned with something stranger and arguably more valuable, proof that somewhere out past the edge of the map, strength and heart aren't always the same thing, and the beings who understand that are worth more than any weapon ever could be. Live long and prosper. More stories await.